There is something uniquely satisfying about a mystery that never gets solved. Not because the answer doesn't matter, but because the not knowing becomes part of the experience. You turn it over in your mind in the quiet dark, and the question itself becomes a kind of companion. It keeps you company without demanding anything from you. It just sits there, gently unresolved, waiting. Family Guy has been on television since January of 1999, more than 25 years. More than 430 episodes across 23 seasons, with more already in production under a massive renewal deal that will carry the show at least through its 30th anniversary. In all that time, across all those episodes, across all the writers who have worked on it, and all the directions it has moved in and out of, the show has accumulated something remarkable, a collection of genuine mysteries, questions embedded so deep into the fabric of the show that they have become inseparable from it unanswered, not because anyone forgot to address them, but because the ambiguity turned out to be more useful, more interesting, and in some cases more emotionally honest than any clean resolution could have been. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of them. Every strange corner of this show's lore, every character's secret that was hinted at but never fully explained, every moment that made you pause and think, wait, how does that actually work? We are going to take our time, we are going to go slow. Each section is going to sit with its mystery for a while, turning it over, looking at it from different angles, not rushing toward any conclusion that the show itself refused to offer. So, settle in, get comfortable, let your breathing slow down, let the weight of the day leave your shoulders. And let's begin, quietly, at the very beginning of the question that fans have been asking since the show's very first episode aired. Section 1, the question that started everything. Who can actually hear Stewie Griffin? Picture the living room of the Griffin house on Spooner Street. It is a Wednesday evening in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, and Lois Griffin is in the kitchen making dinner. Stewie is in his high chair. He is 1 year old. He has a football-shaped head and a yellow shirt and a deep, theatrical, British-inflected voice that sounds like it was borrowed from the villain in a spy film made in the 1960s. And he is, at this particular moment, delivering a monologue. It is not a babbling monologue. It is not the incomprehensible stream of sounds that a real 1-year-old produces. It is a fully formed speech, grammatically precise, rhetorically sophisticated, laced with vocabulary that would challenge a college student. He is discussing his current project, some device, some contraption, some piece of weapons technology that he has been building in his bedroom and what he plans to do with it, which is broadly described as the destruction of his mother and the subjugation of the human race, in whichever order presents itself most conveniently. Lois walks by. She smiles the warm, slightly preoccupied smile of a mother who sees a baby in a high chair making sounds. She picks up a toy he has dropped, puts it back on his tray, says something like, "Here you go, sweetie," and walks back into the kitchen. She has not registered the speech. The content arrived at her ears and passed through without leaving a mark. And somewhere at home, on a couch, a viewer has just registered, for the first time or the 100th, the central mystery of Stewie Griffin's existence. The question that has never had a satisfying answer. Not in 25 years. Not across 430 episodes. Not despite Seth MacFarlane himself having offered what sounds like an explanation on more than one occasion. Who can hear Stewie? Who in this fictional world is actually receiving and comprehending what he says? The surface reading of the early seasons suggests a fairly clean rule. Brian can hear Stewie and the rest of the world mostly cannot. Brian, the family's white Labrador who speaks, drives a car, and functions in every meaningful way as a human being, is Stewie's primary conversational partner. Their exchanges are real. Brian responds to what Stewie says with the fluency of someone having a genuine back and forth. He is startled by Stewie's more alarming statements. He is amused by others. He is occasionally frightened. He is, essentially, a full participant in every conversation, and this makes their relationship the most grounded in the show, because it is the only one where Stewie is truly being heard. Lois, in the early seasons, seems to fall clearly on the other side. She does not respond to the content of Stewie's speech. She responds to Stewie as a baby, which means she responds to his presence, his needs, his tone of distress or contentment, but not to the actual words coming out of his mouth. The joke depends on this gap. Stewie says something specifically threatening, sometimes about Lois herself, sometimes about the world in general, sometimes about weapons he has concealed somewhere in the house. And Lois responds by doing something completely ordinary, like adjusting his bib or calling him a little angel. The distance between what was said and what was heard is enormous, and that distance is where the humor lives. But here is where it gets complicated. Here is where the clean rule starts to bend. Because Family Guy has never been content to maintain a rule cleanly once it has established one, and the rule about who hears Stewie begins to wobble almost immediately after it is introduced. There are episodes, not isolated moments, but multiple sustained examples across many seasons where characters who should not be able to understand Stewie clearly respond to the exact content of what he has said. Peter, who is perhaps the least attentive person in the household, sometimes replies to Stewie's statements in ways that track the actual words rather than just the sounds. Teachers, strangers, people who have no special relationship with Stewie and no established ability to comprehend him, will occasionally register what he is saying and respond to it directly. Fellow babies in a small number of episodes seem to understand him perfectly, which raises entirely different questions about whether cognition in this world is distributed differently than it appears. Chris, the middle child, ends up in a genuinely puzzling category. He is not particularly bright, which is a generous characterization. He is sweet, directionless, enthusiastic in ways that don't produce useful results. He is not the kind of person you would predict would have a special capacity for anything. And yet there are episodes where Chris quite clearly understands every word Stewie says and responds to it appropriately. This has led to fan discussions about whether some quality of Chris's mind, perhaps a kind of childlike openness, perhaps a literal lack of the mental filtering that blocks other adults, makes him receptive in a way that more sophisticated thinkers are not. Meg similarly occupies a middle ground. There are episodes where she hears Stewie and episodes where she doesn't, and the show switches between these without explanation. The fan wiki devoted to Family Guy lore has created an entire taxonomy for this, a classification system that divides characters into consistent understanders, inconsistent understanders, and consistent non-understanders, and then documents evidence for each. The list runs into dozens of entries. The sheer complexity of that catalog tells you something important. This is not a question with a simple answer, and the people who love this show have been thinking about it for a very long time. Seth MacFarlane has commented on this multiple times over the years, and his standard explanation is this: everyone can hear Stewie. The characters are not literally unable to understand him. They hear his words. They understand the words. They simply choose, consciously or unconsciously, not to process the content seriously, because a baby expressing those ideas is too absurd to engage with. A 1-year-old child saying, in a clipped British accent, that he intends to build a ray gun capable of altering the molecular structure of any biological material he targets. A parent doesn't engage with that the way they would engage with an adult, making the same statement. The brain classifies it as baby babbling even when the baby babbling contains specific technical specifications for a weapon. There is something philosophically interesting in this explanation. It suggests that Stewie's greatest protection is not secrecy, but the cognitive refusal of adults to believe that the words he's saying can mean what they appear to mean. The filter isn't about whether the words reach the ears. The filter is about whether the ears connect to the part of the brain that says, wait, this is serious. And in a world where a baby speaking sophisticated English is considered a normal enough occurrence that no one mentions it, the adults have collectively decided that the content of what the baby says exists in a category of not real, and everything in that category can be safely ignored. That explanation is coherent. It might even be true, but it still doesn't account for all the moments when characters do respond to Stewie's content directly, with responses that cannot be explained as simple coincidence or parallel train of thought. And it doesn't explain why Lois's capacity to hear him seems to fluctuate dramatically from episode to episode, present in some scenes, absent in others, with no consistent pattern that maps onto her relationship to Stewie, or her emotional state, or anything else the show makes available as an explanation. The fan wiki also tracks a more granular set of data, not just which characters can hear Stewie, but which categories of statement they tend to hear and which they don't. It turns out that characters are more likely to respond to Stewie's practical requests, things that have an immediate behavioral consequence, like asking for his bottle or requesting that someone get something for him, than to his philosophical pronouncements or his descriptions of his plans. This suggests that what characters are filtering is not his speech in general, but specifically the content that would require them to take him seriously as an agent with dangerous intentions. The mundane Stewie can be heard. The dangerous Stewie cannot. The brain filters for threat in a way that protects the peace of the household by making the threatening parts inaudible. In 2025, the show reached its 450th episode, which is a staggering number for any animated comedy. The writers marked this milestone with an episode called Edible Arrangement, which, after 27 years of the show being on television, finally gave audiences a scene where Lois fully understood every word Stewie was saying to her. The catch, and of course there is a catch, was that Lois had consumed marijuana edibles and was in a significantly altered state. The implication the episode builds toward is that Lois's ordinary consciousness acts as a kind of filter. Her baseline state is one in which she receives Stewie's words but routes them through the category of baby sounds, and those sounds are processed as noise rather than communication. The edibles disrupted that filter. They removed the sorting mechanism, and without the mechanism in place, his voice came through clearly and completely. It is, in some ways, the most emotionally resonant thing the show could have done with this question after 27 years. Because what it suggests is that Lois has been standing next to her child, day after day, year after year, hearing sounds that could have been words and not quite managing to get across the threshold of comprehension that would turn them from sounds into sentences. Not because she's a bad mother, not because she's incapable, but because normal human perception comes with a set of defaults, and one of those defaults is that the baby in the high chair is babbling, and that default is very hard to override without pharmaceutical assistance. The episode wraps up, as Family Guy episodes do, and resets. The next episode, Lois does not understand Stewie with unusual clarity. The edibles wore off. The filter came back. The mystery reasserts itself. There is one more angle worth sitting with here, and it is the darker one. If McFarlane is right, if the characters do literally hear and process Stewie's speech but simply choose not to engage with the content, then the comedy of the show has a troubling underbelly that it almost never acknowledges. Because Stewie has, in those early seasons especially, described in considerable and specific detail his desire to harm members of his family. He has described weapons. He has described plans. He has said things about his mother, in her presence, that if said by an adult would constitute a serious threat. And the adults around him have heard those things and responded by adjusting his bib and offering him a bottle. The show treats this as straightforwardly funny. And it is funny. The gap between the words and the response is the engine of the joke. But the question of what it means to be in a room where someone is describing wanting to harm you and to hear those words and categorize them as not applicable is a question that goes somewhere the show has never followed it. It is the darkness beneath the comedy, the thing that the joke requires you not to think about directly, because thinking about it directly would change the joke into something else entirely. The mystery of who here's Stewie is, ultimately, the mystery of a show that built its central comedy on a premise it could not fully commit to without breaking the premise. If everyone could hear Stewie clearly, there would be no comedic gap. If nobody could hear Stewie at all, there could be no conversations, no relationships, no Brian. The show needed it to be both, and for 25 years it has maintained that impossible position with remarkable consistency, adjusting the rules as needed, never locking them down, keeping the question alive because the question is more useful than any answer would be. Before we go further into these mysteries, let's take a quiet moment. If you're watching this from somewhere specific, a bedroom in a city, a house in the countryside, somewhere you've traveled to, somewhere you've always been, drop it in the comments. Tell us the time and the place. These videos reach people in corners of the world I never expect, and knowing where you're watching from makes all the difference. And if you haven't subscribed yet, that small action keeps this channel breathing. Thank you. Now back to the questions. Beyond the comedy and the philosophy, the hearing question touches something real about what the show fundamentally is. Every long-running fiction creates a set of rules that the audience comes to depend on, and those rules create expectations. When a show violates its own rules consistently and without acknowledgement, something interesting happens to the way the audience relates to it. They stop trusting the rules. They stop expecting the fiction to be internally consistent. They begin instead to operate in a mode of moment-by-moment engagement, taking each scene on its own terms, rather than connecting it to a larger system. Family Guy has, arguably, trained its audience to do exactly this with the Stewie question. Viewers stopped trying to work out when he can and can't be heard decades ago. They adapted. They learned to experience each scene freshly, without the expectation that it would be governed by rules established in previous scenes. And this adaptation, which started with the hearing question, became the general mode by which the audience experiences everything in the show. Nothing is expected to be consistent. Nothing is expected to connect perfectly. Each moment is evaluated on its own terms. This is an unusual kind of relationship between a show and its audience. Most serialized fiction trains its viewers to be continuity-minded, to connect events across time, to build meaning from accumulated history. Family Guy trained its viewers to let go of accumulation, to start fresh each week, to enjoy the moment without worrying about how it fits. And the hearing question is where that training began, all the way back in the first episode. The show told the audience, from the very start, we are not going to be consistent about this. You will not be able to predict when the rule applies. You will have to decide, each time, whether to engage with Stewie as someone being heard or not heard, and we reserve the right to change the answer without warning. The audience accepted those terms, and by accepting them with respect to Stewie, they accepted them for everything else. The show's relationship with its own continuity, with the consistency of its world and its characters, was established in that first question about who can hear a baby, and the answer was, it depends, and we will not tell you what it depends on. Section 2. The Enigma of Brian Griffin. Why can a Labrador Retriever talk, drive a car, and attend an Ivy League university? Brian Edward Griffin is described in official Family Guy materials as a 10-year-old white Labrador Retriever. He lives with the Griffin family. He walks on his hind legs as a default, using his front legs as arms. He drives a second-generation Toyota Prius. His license plate reads BRI Dog, with the casual competence of someone who has been driving for years. He attends dinner parties. He makes martinis. He reviews literature. He once held a temporary position as a writer for The New Yorker after briefly attending Brown University. He has had romantic relationships with human women, several of which were genuine and emotionally significant. He has written novels, short stories, and a self-help book that became a bestseller. He has a bank account, a safety deposit box, and inside that box, in one of the most devastating reveals the show ever produced, a gun he keeps there because he has thought about using it on himself. Brian Griffin is not a pet. By any meaningful measure, Brian Griffin is a person. He happens to have the body of a dog, but the interior life, the emotional complexity, the intellectual aspiration, the self-destructive tendencies, and the social existence of a person. And the show has never, not once in 25 years, explained how this came to be. The absence of explanation is, in its own way, a decision. The show had 25 years and more than 400 episodes to drop even a single line of dialogue that would gesture toward a reason for Brian's existence. It could have been a throwaway joke. It could have been a one-sentence footnote in a cutaway. It could have been a brief origin moment tucked into the middle of an otherwise unrelated episode. None of this happened. The show simply presents Brian as a given, treats his human attributes as unremarkable, and moves on to whatever the story requires. This is interesting, partly because the world of Family Guy does not, in fact, make talking animals a general rule. Other dogs in this world are dogs. They do not talk, they do not drive cars, they do not have feelings about Dostoevsky. When other dogs appear in episodes, they behave as dogs. When Brian walks past them on the street, he is clearly a different category of being, and nobody around him seems to find this unusual. His neighbors treat him as a neighbor. His veterinarian, when he is obligated to see one, treats him with the specific condescension reserved for pets, which Brian finds genuinely insulting. The world has sorted him into a category, and the category is ambiguous, and the ambiguity is never resolved. There is one detail the show provides that is more suggestive than it first appears. The episode, Brian, Portrait of a Dog, from the very first season, establishes the broad contours of how Brian came to live with the Griffins. Peter found him as a stray. Specifically, Peter found him by the side of a road, a grown dog, already capable of speech, already walking upright, already in possession of the full range of human cognitive ability. Peter offered him food, they made a connection, and Brian came home with him. The story is told warmly. It positions Peter as the person who gave Brian a family and a home when he had neither. Later episodes complicate this origin so thoroughly that it becomes something close to incoherent. The episode The Man with Two Brians introduces home video footage of Brian as a puppy, tiny, months old, in a domestic setting that appears to have warmth and routine around it. The puppy Brian of this footage is being held, is living in what looks like a home rather than the outdoors. If Peter found Brian as an adult stray wandering a road, this footage cannot exist. A grown stray does not have puppy home videos in a family's possession. The show introduces this footage without comment, without acknowledgement that it contradicts the established origin. It simply includes it, lets it sit there in the episode, and moves on. And then, many seasons later, an episode titled Who's Brian now reveals that Brian had an entirely separate family before the Griffins. A family who knew him, who were attached to him, and from whom he was somehow separated before turning up on the road where Peter found him. The episode does not explain how the separation happened. It does not explain the puppy home videos. It does not reconcile any of this with the adult stray story from the first season. It simply adds another piece of Brian's backstory to a pile of pieces that do not fit together. What the show has done with Brian's biology is equally puzzling. Brian has, over the course of the show, fathered a child. His son Dylan is the result of a relationship Brian had with a woman named Sherry during a period of Brian's romantic history that the show depicts with its usual mixture of humor and genuine feeling. Dylan is human, not partly canine. Fully, unambiguously human in every respect the show depicts. A person who went through a period of misbehavior as a young man and then, after an episode centered on his relationship with Brian, appeared to have found his footing. The question of how Brian, whose body is that of a dog, fathered a human child, is one that the show raises indirectly through Dylan's very existence and then declines to answer. Under the standard laws of biology, it cannot happen. Two different species cannot reproduce. A dog and a human cannot have a human child. But Dylan exists, and the show treats his existence as factual, which means the show's biology is operating according to rules that are never stated. The fan theory that tries to make the most coherent sense of all of this involves the shared universe between Family Guy and American Dad. Both shows exist in the same world. This has been confirmed by various crossover references and by the creators. American Dad contains a number of anthropomorphic animals who are eventually, in that show's storyline, connected to CIA experimentation. The idea, in that show's mythology, is that government programs have at various points produced animals with enhanced cognition, human-level communication, and capabilities far beyond anything that naturally evolved. The show stops short of making this explicit in American Dad, but the suggestion is present. If Brian is the product of similar experimentation, if something in his genetic or neurological architecture was altered before the story begins, then his human cognition, his human speech, his ability to reproduce with a human partner, his emotional and intellectual complexity, all of it becomes explainable within the same framework. He is not naturally occurring. He is a created thing, produced by some program or experiment that was never disclosed to him and that the show has never named. This could also explain why he is uniquely capable of hearing and understanding Stewie. If Brian's neurological wiring is closer to human than canine, he might operate on the same frequency as Stewie's cognition in a way that other animals do not. The loveliest theory about Brian, however, the one that doesn't try to explain him biologically, but instead finds a kind of meaning in his inexplicability, is the one that positions him as the author of the show itself. This theory has circulated in fan communities for years. It goes like this. The world of Family Guy is a story that Brian wrote. He is the narrator. He is the creator within the fiction. The show is his autobiography, rendered in the most flattering light he could manage. He is the smartest person in his household, the most articulate, the most cultured, the most morally aware, even when his actual behavior falls well short of those qualities. Peter is dumb because Brian perceives Peter as dumb. Lois is patient because Brian needs her to be patient for the family structure to work. The cutaway gags are Brian's tangential thoughts. The inconsistencies in the timeline are the inconsistencies of memory and narrative, rather than the inconsistencies of a poorly managed canon. What makes this theory interesting beyond its cleverness is that it explains something real about the show's relationship between Brian and McFarlane. Brian shares almost all of McFarlane's stated views on politics, religion, culture, and aesthetic taste. McFarlane voices Brian without significantly modifying his natural speaking voice. The distance between them is the smallest of any character in the show. If Family Guy is, in some sense, a projection of McFarlane's perspective on a dysfunctional world, where he is the only truly intelligent person, and it sometimes does feel that way, then Brian is the avatar of that projection. Brian, as the show's secret author, isn't just a fan theory. It's a way of describing what the show already is. None of this answers the question. The question of why Brian can talk has no answer the show is willing to provide. But the theories that have grown up around the question, the CIA experimentation, the authorship conceit, the implications of Dylan's human birth are, in their own way, more interesting than a simple canonical explanation would have been. The mystery makes Brian larger than he would be if the show had just said, he's a genetically modified dog. The mystery lets him be whatever the moment requires. And that flexibility is perhaps the truest thing the show has ever done for him. There is also the question of Brian's age, which the show has handled with characteristic imprecision. He is described, across different references, as somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. In dog years, depending on the conversion method used, this would make him somewhere between 50 and 70 in human equivalent years. He would be, by the logic of his own biology, middle-aged or elderly. The show never engages with this. Brian is not depicted as aging. He has not shown signs of the physical decline that dogs at his described age typically exhibit. He is, like everyone else in this universe, suspended in a kind of permanent present that doesn't account for the passing of years, even when the years are explicitly counted. His death and return in Season 12 is the strangest chapter in his history. He was hit by a car. He died in a scene that was treated with genuine dramatic weight. The family gathered around him. He said goodbye. Stewie held him. And then, 2 episodes later, Stewie retrieved a time travel device and went back and saved him, and Brian returned as though none of it had happened. The death that wasn't, the goodbye that didn't stick, added to the contradictory origin stories, the impossible offspring, the unexplained cognition. Brian Griffin's existence is one of the most thoroughly unresolved things in the show's entire canon. There is one more dimension of Brian's mystery that rarely gets discussed, and it involves his relationship with his own dogness. Brian is, physiologically, a dog. He has dog instincts that occasionally surface despite his intellectual overlay. He has been shown to react to certain stimuli in automatic, instinctive ways that reveal an animal nature operating beneath the cultural overlay. He barks on occasion. He has chased things. He has had reactions to smells and sounds that a purely rational being would filter out. He is not entirely the urbane intellectual he presents himself as. Somewhere below the Martinis and the New Yorker subscription, there is a dog. This creates, when you think about it, a genuinely unusual kind of internal experience. Brian has to manage the gap between what he is biologically and what he is intellectually and socially. He has human appetites and animal appetites, human emotions and animal instincts, and they don't always align neatly. The relationship between these two aspects of his identity, the human overlay and the canine substrate, is something the show has occasionally used for comedy but has never seriously explored. What does it feel like, from the inside, to be what Brian is? To reach for the intellectual life you want while the animal nature you were born with keeps surfacing at inconvenient moments? The show has given us glimpses. The episode Brian and Stewie, widely considered one of the show's finest. A bottle episode in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault overnight and forced into genuine conversation gets closer to this than anything else. When Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in the safety deposit box for the eventuality that he might want to end his own life, and when Stewie's response to that revelation is the raw, unperformed devastation of someone who cannot imagine a world without this specific person in it. The show achieves something it rarely attempts: honesty about what it is actually like to be these characters. The gun is there because Brian's intellectual life has arrived at a place where his biological life feels insufficient. He is smart enough to understand his own limitations and to find them unbearable. He is a dog who knows he is a dog, which is a much lonelier condition than simply being a dog. This is the Brian Griffin that fans mourned when the show killed him. Not the pretentious novelist or the failed writer or the serial womanizer that the later seasons leaned on too heavily. The one who sat in a bank vault and told the truth. The one whose insolubility, the question of what he actually is, was the source of his deepest sadness and, in the right moments, his most genuine connection. Section 3. Stewie's British accent and the real voice hidden beneath 16 seasons of performance. For 16 years of Family Guy, nobody asked Stewie Griffin the obvious question. In 16 seasons, across hundreds of episodes, not a single character in the world of this show thought to say, out loud, in a way that required an answer, Why do you have a British accent? You were born in Rhode Island. Your parents are from Rhode Island. Your father is the least refined person currently living in New England. Your mother has a New York inflection that she probably picked up from her own mother. Your siblings sound like they grew up within 10 miles of Providence. You, however, sound like you attended prep school in the English countryside before spending several formative years in London. How? The question went unasked for 16 years. The accent was simply part of Stewie, as inseparable from him as the football-shaped head, as the yellow shirt, as the single-minded focus on world domination, and the elimination of his mother. You didn't interrogate the accent because the accent was fundamental to the joke. The refinement of the voice was the whole point. Strip the accent away and you strip away something essential about what makes Stewie's villainy funny, what makes his observations land, what makes the gap between his appearance a baby in a diaper and his manner of speech so delightfully absurd. And then, in the 16th season, in an episode called Send in Stewie, Please, the show finally went there. And the answer it gave was not the one anyone expected. The episode is unusual in the history of Family Guy for several reasons. It aired without commercial interruption, an extremely rare choice that signals, before a single scene has played, that the writers know they're doing something different. It features only 2 characters from the main cast, Stewie and a child psychologist named Dr. Cecil Pritchfield, played by Sir Ian McKellen. Every other regular character is absent. No cutaway gags, or very nearly none. The episode is, essentially, a 2-character play set in a therapist's office, and it asks Stewie to be more vulnerable than he has been in 15 years of the show. The therapy session was prompted by an incident at school. Stewie pushed a classmate named Tyler down a flight of stairs. The school, understandably, has questions. Stewie arrives at Pritchfield's office with his armor fully on the sharp wit, the deflection, the immediate attempt to turn the analysis around and begin psychoanalyzing the therapist. He is, from the first moment, trying to make this a performance rather than an examination. He compliments Pritchfield's choice of artwork on the walls. He notices the photograph on the therapist's desk, a vacation photo with McKellen's character's husband, and begins to psychoanalyze the relationship from a single image with uncomfortable precision. He is stalling. He is doing what he always does, which is to fill the space with his own voice so that someone else's questions cannot find a foothold. Pritchfield is not fooled. He is himself British, and early in the session he makes a reference to a word, the word controversy, pronounced in the British fashion as controversy, and Stewie echoes the pronunciation automatically. And then something flickers across his face. A recognition. A miscalculation. Because Stewie should not know how a native British speaker pronounces that word unless the British English he has been surrounded by is his own performance of it, deeply practiced and deeply studied. Until it became instinct. Pritchfield hears the echo, connects the dots, and says quietly that he doesn't notice the British accent. That whatever Stewie is projecting, it doesn't read as authentic to a genuine British speaker. The moment that follows is one of the more unexpectedly real things Family Guy has ever put on screen. Stewie, stripped of a layer of protection by a man who saw through it more easily than anyone in his life ever has, does what people do when the armor gets past. He defends, then deflects, then slowly, incrementally, stops. He describes his accent as an affectation, a coat of armor to get through the day. An image he cultivated so that he could feel special, so that he could create distance between himself and the people around him, so that no one could ever reach him fully or know him clearly. And then he drops it. Stewie's real voice, the voice that Seth MacFarlane produces when he removes the theatrical British construction, sounds like a higher, slightly softer, somewhat nasal version of Peter Griffin, which is exactly what it should sound like. He grew up in the same house as Peter. He was born in Rhode Island. He sounds like a kid from Rhode Island who has not yet fully developed the adult register his voice will eventually find. The accent is gone, and what's left is unmistakably the child of the family he grew up in. The scene where Stewie speaks in this voice for the first time, looking at Pritchfield and then at the room around him and then somewhat at himself, is quietly devastating in the way that only things rooted in real emotional truth tend to be. The bravado is gone. The weapon is set down. There is a 1-year-old boy in a therapist's chair in Rhode Island, and for a few minutes, he is exactly what he is and nothing else. Pritchfield suggests that using his real voice could allow Stewie to connect more genuinely with the people around him, to let people in, to be known rather than performing being known. And Stewie considers this. He holds the idea up and turns it over. And then he thinks about what it would actually cost: the loss of the specialness, the collapse of the persona, the prospect of being, in the therapist's words, like everyone else. And he decides the price is too high. The accent comes back. The armor goes back on. He reverts to the performed version of himself because the real version is too vulnerable to present to the world. And then, with the cold efficiency that has always been Stewie's most reliable quality, he ensures that the only person who has seen his true self cannot share what he saw. Pritchfield has a heart attack during the closing minutes of the session. Stewie declines to retrieve his medication. The therapist dies in the chair. The secret is buried with him. The show returns to normal in the next episode. The accent is back. The persona is intact. Nobody else in the Griffin household is shown having learned anything from the therapy session because Stewie certainly hasn't told them. The revelation resets back to invisible, and the Stewie the world sees is the Stewie he chose. But the question the episode opens, having answered the first one, is this: when did Stewie make this choice? At what point in a life that has so far lasted approximately 12 months did this child decide to construct an alternative vocal identity? The episode reveals that the accent is a choice, but it doesn't explain the origin of the choice. Was there a specific moment, some afternoon, some week, some period of Stewie's development when he began experimenting with a different way of speaking and found that it worked? Found that it created the distance he wanted? A child who constructs an elaborate persona at the age of approximately 6 months is a child who felt from almost the beginning of consciousness that the self he was born with was insufficient. Not inadequate in the sense of being defective. Insufficient in the sense of being ordinary. Not special enough. Not distinct enough. Not protected enough. The accent is a solution to a problem Stewie identified so early in his life that most people would not yet have the capacity to identify any problems at all. There is something profoundly lonely in that, if you follow it long enough. The baby in the diaper, walking through the house on Spooner Street, speaking in the voice of a Bond villain, carrying the full weight of a performance he has never been able to put down, surrounded by people who hear the voice but not the person inside it. Brian comes the closest to the person inside it. Their friendship, the real thing at the center of the show's best episodes, is the closest Stewie gets to being genuinely known by anyone, and even Brian doesn't know about the accent. Even Brian has heard the performance so consistently that the distinction between Stewie and Stewie's persona has probably become invisible to him. Seth MacFarlane has spoken in interviews about where the voice came from, the real-world inspiration for the theatrical construction. He cited Rex Harrison specifically, the voice of Professor Henry Higgins in the My Fair Lady cast recording. The connection is beautiful once you notice it. Henry Higgins is a man who makes a project of remaking another person's voice and identity. He takes someone who speaks differently from the way he expects people to speak and teaches her to perform a different version of herself. Stewie, who taught himself to perform a different version of himself, is a kind of reverse Higgins, a Higgins who is also his own Eliza Doolittle. He heard something in that voice, perhaps from a recording or perhaps from something in the ambient culture of the world he was born into, and he decided, that's what I want to be. And then he became it. The episode that answered one mystery left this one standing. The accent is fake. The voice beneath it is real. The space between them is where the most interesting and the least examined version of Stewie Griffin lives. The accent mystery also connects to a broader question about performance and identity that the show has never directly addressed, but that the episode makes unavoidable. Every character in Family Guy is, in some sense, performing. Peter performs the role of the lovable buffoon. Lois performs the role of the competent manager. Meg performs invisibility. Stewie's performance is simply more self-aware than the others. He chose his costume deliberately, constructed it with the specific intention of keeping people at a distance. But the show suggests that all the characters are doing something similar, just with less self-awareness about it. When Stewie drops the accent and speaks in his real voice, what he is doing is removing the costume. The Stewie who speaks with that quiet suburban Rhode Island inflection is the Stewie without the armor, the Stewie who hasn't yet decided what he's going to be, the Stewie who is genuinely uncertain and vulnerable, and 1-year-old in a world where almost nothing is figured out yet. And the choice to put the costume back on at the end of the episode to return to the performance, to restore the armor, is not just Stewie's choice. It is a demonstration of the choice that all the characters in this show make, constantly, every episode, to continue being the version of themselves that the show requires them to be, rather than the version of themselves that might be truer or softer or more confused. The show never explores what it would mean for Stewie to stop performing. The episode glimpses it and then closes the door, but the glimpse is enough. Enough to know that underneath the voice and the grand schemes and the weapons and the theatrical villainy, there is a child who is afraid that the real version of him isn't interesting enough to be worth knowing. And that fear, which is the most ordinary fear in the world, is the thing that no one in his family has ever addressed, because they have never had access to it. They only know the performance. Only Pritchfield knew, and Pritchfield is gone. Section 4. The question the show kept promising to answer. What is Stewie's sexuality? The question of Stewie Griffin's sexuality has been one of the most consistently discussed elements of Family Guy across its entire run. It has been raised in fan spaces, in critical writing about the show, in interviews with its creators, and in several episodes that seem to approach a direct answer before stepping back at the last moment. After more than 25 years, it remains technically unresolved, not because the writers don't have views, but because the specific kind of openness they have chosen to maintain has turned out to be more dramatically useful and, arguably, more honest than any definitive answer would have been. To understand why this question has such staying power, you have to go back to the very beginning of Stewie's character and look at what the writers built into him from the start. In the early seasons of Family Guy, Stewie's primary identity was the evil genius baby. That was the central joke. The baby who spoke like a villain, built advanced weapons, plotted world domination, and wanted to murder his mother. Within that primary identity, certain secondary qualities were present almost from the beginning. Stewie's sensibilities were coded in ways that the show, existing in the specific cultural moment of the late 1990s and early 2000s, associated with queerness, he cared about aesthetics in a way that felt at odds with conventional masculine presentation. He worried, in one of the earliest episodes, about whether his diaper made his behind look large, which is not a concern that the show's writers thought typical for male characters, especially not one-year-old male characters. He noticed fashion. He responded to beauty in ways that crossed expected gender lines. As the seasons went on, the implications became less oblique. Stewie began cross-dressing with regularity, and, more significantly, began doing so with what appeared to be genuine ease and pleasure, rather than the discomfort or reluctance the show might have used to play it purely for laughs. He had a girlfriend, Olivia, in a storyline that included a marriage and a mutual and spectacular falling out, but the energy of that relationship, the ambition, the performance, the way Stewie's feelings seemed to live at the surface of himself, in that dynamic felt different from his most intense emotional connections, which were consistently with Brian. With Brian, something else was operating. The dependency was real. The need was real. The devastation when Brian was gone was the most raw that Stewie has ever been on this show. The show's creator weighed in on this publicly for the first time in 2009 in an interview with Playboy magazine. McFarlane described an episode that had been written all the way through the script stage, in which Stewie comes out. The episode had a time travel component, Stewie going back to prevent a specific passage from Leviticus from being written and was killed in development. McFarlane's stated reasoning for killing it was rooted in Stewie's age. A one-year-old cannot be gay, he said, in the sense that a one-year-old doesn't have a defined sexuality. He also offered the prediction that Stewie would ultimately turn out to be gay or, in his words, a very unhappy, repressed heterosexual. The phrasing is doing a lot of work. There is no version of that sentence where Stewie ends up as a comfortably straight person who simply never happened to think about it. The most direct engagement with the question came in the 2018 episode, Send in Stewie, Please. Writer Gary Janetti and executive producer Rich Appel had extensive conversations with McFarlane about whether this episode would finally provide the definitive answer about Stewie's orientation, and the answer they collectively landed on was no. McFarlane's stated position was that Stewie's sexuality should stay uncertain because he is still a baby, and sexuality is a deeply fluid thing that cannot and should not be determined in a one-year-old. Appel echoed this, describing the uncertainty as something worth preserving rather than resolving. Janetti's comments on the subject were the most revealing. He described Stewie's uncertainty about his own sexuality as giving him vulnerability, and said that that vulnerability was essential to the character. The uncertainty is not an absence of information. It's an emotional quality. A person who doesn't know who they are yet, who is in the process of figuring out what they want and who they love and what category of themselves they inhabit, that person carries a specific kind of openness and searching that a person who has all those answers does not. In the episode itself, Stewie addresses the subject in the most Stewie way possible by approaching it, circling it, and then deflecting from it with comic fury. He tells Pritchfield that he pushed Tyler down the stairs because he likes him, and is afraid Tyler won't like him back. He specifies, sharply and with evident irritation, that he doesn't mean like him. He's not gay. He says this twice. He is annoyed that the implication is there, and annoyed that he can hear himself making the implication while denying it. He says he's confident in his heterosexuality, and then immediately undermines the confidence by questioning whether heterosexual is a word at all. He mentions, almost in passing, that Grant Gustin and he would make an adorable Instagram couple, which is not something a person who is fully committed to their heterosexuality typically says with the relaxed, casual certainty Stewie brings to it. The episode's conclusion on this subject is that Stewie is sexually fluid. He is in the process of discovering what he is, which is a process that a 1-year-old cannot reasonably be expected to have completed. This is a responsible and even affectionate way to handle the question, but it is also a deferral, a commitment to future non-commitment, an answer that preserves the mystery by naming the mystery as the answer. For fans who see Stewie as a queer character who have found in his coded qualities and his particular brand of self-construction something that speaks to their own experience, the show's refusal to commit is both understandable and somewhat frustrating. A character who might be queer, who the writers strongly imply is queer without formally stating it, occupies a genuinely ambiguous space. There are readings of that ambiguity that are generous. The writers are respecting the complexity of identity and not forcing a label onto a character who cannot meaningfully understand labels yet. There are also readings that are less generous. The writers are enjoying the cultural capital of a queer-coded character without taking any of the risks that full commitment would involve. Both readings are available. Both readings are defensible. The mystery stays open, and it will presumably stay open for as long as the show runs, which, given the current renewal situation, means at least 4 more years of productive ambiguity lie ahead. What lives underneath the question in the show's more recent seasons is something the early Stewie, the dangerous baby with the ray gun, would not have had access to. The current version of Stewie, softer and more emotionally available and more capable of genuine love, has a warmth that makes the question of who he loves more interesting and more consequential than it would be for a character whose primary trait was cold ambition. He cares about Brian in a way that is one of the most genuine things on the show. Whether that caring constitutes romantic love, or whether it is a form of attachment that Stewie hasn't yet developed the vocabulary to categorize, is not something anyone in his world has asked him, and not something he appears to have asked himself. What makes the sexuality question particularly rich as a mystery is the way it intersects with the arc of Stewie's character across the show's history. The original evil baby had no apparent sexuality. His primary drive was ambition and power and the specific grievance he had against his mother. Sexuality as a dimension of his character was introduced gradually, as part of the broader humanization process that transformed him from a one-dimensional villain into something more emotionally complex. The introduction of sexuality as a theme in Stewie's storylines happened at the same time as the introduction of genuine emotional depth, which is interesting because it suggests that the writers understood them as connected. A character with no interior emotional life has no sexuality in any meaningful sense. They are driven by external goals rather than internal desires. Adding sexuality to Stewie was, in this reading, part of adding interiority to him, giving him something he wanted that was personal rather than world historical. Something that wasn't about power but about connection. And the specific ambiguity of what that sexuality is, the refusal to fix it, the commitment to keeping it uncertain, mirrors the larger ambiguity that the show has maintained about who Stewie is. Stewie without the evil genius is a less defined character. Stewie without a fixed identity is a more interesting one. The sexuality question, kept deliberately open, keeps Stewie in a permanent state of becoming. He is always in the process of figuring out who he is, which means he is always in a state of genuine dramatic interest rather than having arrived at a settled destination that the writers then have to find ways to make compelling. The irony is that the show's commitment to this ambiguity actually serves the character better than resolution would have. A Stewie who is simply gay is interesting in some ways and loses his mystery in others. A Stewie who might be gay, who acts in ways that suggest it, who deflects the question with furious energy, who says he's confident in his heterosexuality while immediately undermining the confidence that Stewie is perpetually unresolved in a way that generates story and conversation and the specific kind of engagement that comes from a character the audience is still trying to figure out. The question will presumably persist for as long as the show continues, and perhaps that is exactly where it belongs. Section 5. Peter Griffin's True Origins. The secret Thelma kept for 43 years. Most people who watch Family Guy believe they know who Peter Griffin is. Not just in the sense of knowing his character, the impulsiveness, the capacity for comedy and occasional cruelty, the beer drinking, the loud stupidity, the love for his family that exists genuinely somewhere beneath all the mess, but in the biographical sense. The broad facts of his background. Rhode Island family, Catholic upbringing, a demanding father named Francis who was emotionally cold but clearly devoted in the ways he knew how to be. The story of Peter Griffin is, on its surface, the story of a particular kind of American working-class man, defined by where he came from and who raised him. And then in the 5th season, the show quietly removed one of the foundational elements of that story. It revealed that Peter Griffin, the name, the faith, the identity, the entire framework of who he believed himself to be was built on top of a secret his mother had been keeping for over 4 decades. Francis Griffin, the man who raised Peter, was not Peter's biological father. He was never Peter's biological father. He knew this. He knew it for Peter's entire childhood, through every argument, every moment of withholding, every occasion when his strictness or his coldness defined the emotional climate of the house. He raised the boy anyway, and he never said anything. The episode that opens this wound is called Peter's Two Dads, and it arrives in the wake of Francis's death. Grief apparently creates openings that ordinary life keeps closed, because it is in the hypnotherapy session that Brian suggests for Peter's bereavement processing that the buried memory surfaces. A memory of childhood. Francis standing before young Peter, speaking words that Peter had evidently pushed somewhere inaccessible. "I'm not your father." The memory had been suppressed completely. Not just minimized, not just filed away in the category of difficult moments, suppressed, gone. Unavailable to the conscious mind. It took hypnosis to surface it, which tells you something about how the mind handles contradictions that are too large to carry. Peter could not hold the knowledge that the man he called his father was not his father, and also continue to live the life he was living. And so the mind resolved the contradiction by making one of its elements disappear. After the hypnotherapy, Peter goes to his mother Thelma. And Thelma, now that the secret has begun to surface, tells the truth. She was on vacation in Ireland. She met an Irishman. Something happened between them. She came back pregnant. She didn't want her child to grow up without a father, and she had a man in her life who was willing to marry her and raise the child as his own. The Irishman's name was Mickey McFinnigan, and he had no idea a child had resulted from what happened between them. Peter and Brian travel to Ireland to find Mickey. Mickey is the town drunk, a title the village presents as honorable rather than shameful, and he lives in a condition of cheerful dissolution that is initially horrifying to Peter. The connection between them is established through a drinking contest, the logic being that nobody who is not of Mickey's blood could beat Mickey glass for glass. Peter wins. Mickey is convinced. Something begins between them. Now, sit with what this revelation actually means, if you follow it past the comedy. Peter has lived for 53 years under a name that is not biologically his. The Griffin name, the Griffin identity, the chain of relationships that name implies none of it is his by blood. He is, biologically, Peter McFinnigan, Irish in origin. The man who made him strict and Catholic and guilty in all the specific ways Peter is guilty and shaped by that man was a voluntary participant in Peter's life, not an involuntary one. Francis stayed. He chose the child that wasn't his and committed to him, incompletely and imperfectly, in the ways he was capable of. There is something in that detail that the show handles more gracefully than it usually handles anything. Brian points it out directly in the episode. Francis may not have been Peter's real father by blood, but he raised Peter like his own son, which is its own form of love even when that love looks like rigidity and withholding. The stern father who never told Peter the truth is also the man who stayed when he didn't have to. The two facts coexist. The show lets them. The question of why Thelma kept the secret for 43 years is handled less carefully. The show gives the practical reason she wanted Peter to have a father figure in the house, but doesn't excavate the emotional mechanics beneath it. Did she tell Mickey she was pregnant and he refused to acknowledge it, and she decided to protect Peter from that knowledge? Did she never tell Mickey at all, and if so, why? Was there a moment when she almost told Peter and didn't, and what was that moment like? What did it cost her to carry this for 4 decades, watching her son grieve a man who wasn't his father while the real father existed somewhere in rural Ireland as a cheerfully drunk unknown? The show doesn't say. Thelma is, across the run of Family Guy, a character the writers have never quite known what to do with. She is played warmer than Frances and treated more sympathetically, but she remains secondary in the story of Peter's formation, and the 43-year secret she carried is never given the weight it would carry in a show that wanted to take its characters' interior lives seriously. The revelation also does something collateral that the show acknowledges and then moves past quickly. In earlier seasons, the show established that the Griffin family has African ancestry through a man named Nate Griffin, an enslaved man in the 19th century from whom Peter descends. Peter has, in various episodes, invoked this ancestry as part of his own identity. The revelation that he is biologically a McFinnigan and not a Griffin removes that connection entirely. He is not descended from Nate Griffin. He is not related to anyone named Griffin by blood. The history he thought was his, the ancestry he thought he could claim, evaporates with the revelation of his parentage. The show makes note of this and then moves on. Peter continues to use the Griffin name. The Griffin identity persists. The world treats him as Peter Griffin, because Peter Griffin is who he has been for 43 years, and names apparently outlast the biological facts that were supposed to underpin them. The mystery of who Frances Griffin was to Peter, not biologically but emotionally, not genetically but relationally, is one of the most interesting questions the show leaves standing. It is one that neither Peter nor the writers have fully answered, and it is, arguably, the most human question in the show's entire catalog. What does it mean to be raised by a man who is not your father? What does it mean to find out, at 43, that the difficult, complicated love you received was voluntary rather than obligatory? Does that make it more meaningful, or does the deception that accompanied it undermine everything? The show goes to Ireland and comes back and leaves those questions sitting where they were. The question of Peter's Mexican birth is a separate but related mystery that the show addresses in a Season 5 episode called Padre de Familia. It turns out that Thelma, while pregnant with Peter, was in Mexico attempting to end the pregnancy. The procedure didn't work, and Peter was born there. Thelma brought him back to Rhode Island, but because she never completed the proper paperwork to formally register him as an American citizen, Peter has technically been living in the United States as an undocumented immigrant for his entire life. The episode uses this as the basis for a storyline about immigration and citizenship, and Peter eventually resolves his status through the intervention of his father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt. But the implications of it, taken seriously, are considerable. Peter Griffin, whose Rhode Island identity is so central to his character, whose Americanness is essentially the premise of everything about him, who drinks Pawtucket Patriot Ale and roots for New England sports teams and has worked in Rhode Island businesses, his entire adult life, was born in Mexico, lived as an undocumented immigrant for decades without knowing it, and was only formally granted citizenship as an adult through a wealthy and influential father-in-law pulling strings. This layers onto the already complex picture of his origins: the Mexican birth that was unplanned and unwanted, the return to Rhode Island that was managed by a woman who couldn't bring herself to do the official paperwork, the Irish biological father who didn't know Peter existed, the Catholic adoptive father who knew Peter wasn't his and stayed anyway, the Griffin name that is legally his but biologically borrowed, the African-American ancestry through Nate Griffin that was part of his identity until the revelation of his real parentage removed it. Peter's origins are a knot of secrets and complications and circumstances that nobody in his early life thought to explain to him while he was growing up. The man arrived in his 40s, having been raised Catholic, believing himself to be a Griffin, believing himself to have African-American ancestry, not knowing he was born in Mexico, or that he'd been living as an undocumented immigrant, or that his father was a town drunk in Ireland who had no idea he existed. The accumulation of what he didn't know about himself is genuinely staggering, and the show treats each of these revelations with varying levels of seriousness before returning to the default. Section 6. The Giant Chicken. The feud with no logic and no end. If you have watched more than a handful of Family Guy episodes, you have seen the giant chicken fight. You know the sequence. Peter is in the middle of a scene doing something mundane, carrying on a conversation, existing in the ordinary texture of his life, and then a giant anthropomorphic chicken appears. The chicken's name, revealed much later in the show's run, is Ernie. He walks upright, he wears clothes. He is roughly the size of a person and built with what appears to be significant musculature. He and Peter make eye contact. Something passes between them, and then the fight begins. The fight lasts a long time, longer than you expect. Long enough to travel through multiple locations, through buildings, into streets, aboard vehicles, across elevated surfaces, and through subterranean ones. The violence is sustained and elaborate and escalating, and it ends with one of them apparently dead or incapacitated, and then the surviving one walks away, and then the apparently dead one opens his eyes, or moves a limb, or shows some sign of life that means the next fight is already being set up somewhere in the future. These sequences appear at irregular intervals throughout the show's run, always with the same structure, always escalating in scope, always involving collateral damage to the surrounding world that nobody outside the fight seems to particularly notice or respond to. They are one of the most distinctive things about Family Guy, and they are rooted in one of the silliest origin stories in the history of animated television. It started with a coupon. The backstory of the feud was revealed in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, in a flashback that was brief enough to be almost casual about its own absurdity. At some point in the recent past, before the events of the show's main timeline, a giant anthropomorphic chicken gave Peter a coupon. Peter attempted to redeem the coupon. The coupon was expired. Peter was angry. He confronted the chicken. The chicken did not respond in a way that resolved Peter's anger, and the first fight began. The disproportion between cause and consequence is the entire joke. An expired coupon, a minor irritant, the kind of small inconvenience that most people process and forget within the hour, created a feud that has generated enough property damage to destabilize several city blocks on multiple occasions. People have been seriously hurt as collateral damage to these fights. Public infrastructure has been destroyed. The fights have taken Peter and Ernie through hospitals, airports, cruise ships, sewers, and at least one amusement park. The scale of the destruction bears absolutely no relationship to the scale of the original grievance. But there is a wrinkle in the origin story that the show introduced without much fanfare. The episode Meet the Quagmires, a time travel episode in which Peter goes back to the 1980s and tampers with the course of events in his own past, includes a moment at a dance where Peter accidentally punches Ernie in the face. He is not aware that this is the same chicken he will later have an ongoing feud with. He is dancing. It's an accident. Ernie is visibly angry. A friend of Ernie's tells him to let it go, that he'll probably never see that person again, which means that before the coupon incident, there had already been a physical altercation between them. Peter had already struck Ernie in the face, even if unintentionally. When the coupon incident happened later, Ernie may have had a second data point. This is not a random stranger. This is someone who has hit me before. The second offense may have felt like a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Maybe Ernie, at the coupon confrontation, recognized Peter from the earlier moment. Maybe the fury was drawn from something deeper than the coupon alone, something that had been waiting for a reason to release. The show treats this time travel wrinkle as a comedy moment and moves on. But it adds a dimension to the question of why the feud is as persistent and as disproportionate as it is. It is not perhaps simply about the coupon. It may be about a history of being struck by the same person twice, separated by years, with the second strike arriving in the context of a commercial dispute that felt disrespectful. The accumulated grievance theory doesn't make the feud any more rational, but it makes it more human. In the specific way that all irrational sustained grievances are human, they tend to have more than one seed. The third major fight between them ends in the most unexpected way. They stop, they look at each other. Ernie invites Peter to dinner. They go out together. Ernie brings his wife Nicole, whose presence in the show was how the audience learned his name. They have what appears to be a genuinely pleasant meal. Something like reconciliation seems to be occurring. The whole history of violence might be behind them. And then Peter insists on paying the restaurant bill. Ernie also insists. The argument escalates. Peter says something dismissive about Nicole, and the feud restarts. From an expired coupon to a dinner table disagreement about who foots the bill, the pattern replicates itself at a smaller scale. demonstrating that the flaw that started everything is not a situational flaw, but a character flaw, a specific combination of stubbornness and the inability to let small things go that Peter carries through every context. The show understands, even if it never says so directly, that the content of the fight has never really been about the coupon or the restaurant bill. What the show is really depicting is the thing that happens when two people lock into a pattern of conflict that takes on a life of its own. The original grievance ceases to matter. What matters is the pattern. What matters is the fact that this is what they do when they encounter each other, and that pattern has become so deeply established that neither of them can easily step outside it. The mystery that remains genuinely unresolved is what Ernie actually is. He is a giant anthropomorphic chicken who participates in human commerce, human social rituals, human relationships. He has a wife. He presumably has some kind of employment or income. He exists in the world of this show in a way that nobody finds unusual, which means the world has a framework for accommodating him that it never describes. How many beings like Ernie are there? Does he have a life outside of the feud with Peter that the show never shows because it is always just out of frame? Is Ernie, when not fighting, simply a person who lives in a community and goes to work and comes home and has dinner with his wife and doesn't think about Peter Griffin at all until the next encounter? The show implies that Ernie's existence between fights is normal and unremarkable, which makes the fights more absurd rather than less. He is not a supernatural antagonist who appears only to fight Peter. He is a neighbor, essentially. A community member, a being with a wife and a social life, and apparently a name that his wife uses in affectionate contexts. And when he happens to encounter Peter Griffin, everything goes sideways. The other dimension of the giant chicken mystery worth exploring is what it says about the show's relationship with consequence. The battles between Peter and Ernie are perhaps the purest expression of the show's willingness to generate spectacular destruction without any accountability. Buildings collapse. Subway trains derail. Bridges are damaged. People in the vicinity of these two beings are genuinely hurt, not in the exaggerated cartoon slapstick way of early physical comedy, but in ways that the show depicts with visual specificity. Blood. Broken bones. The unmistakable signs of people being caught in something they didn't choose and couldn't avoid. And when the fight ends, nothing is addressed. Peter returns to the scene he left, battered and bruised, and picks up exactly where he left off. Nobody mentions the damage. Nobody discusses the people who were hurt. No insurance claims are filed. No investigations are opened. The world simply absorbs what happened and returns to baseline, exactly as the show itself does after every dramatic event. The giant chicken fights are, in this reading, a concentrated version of the show's general approach to consequence. They happen. They generate spectacle. They end. The world moves on as if they didn't happen. And the next time Ernie appears, the cycle begins again, because the cycle's persistence depends on nobody ever being held accountable for what the cycle produces. There is something darkly comic about this when you name it directly. The feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken, which has generated what would constitute significant criminal liability in any jurisdiction, continues entirely unmolested by any legal or social consequence. The police of Quahog, Rhode Island, who are represented in the show primarily by Joe Swanson, do not investigate. The insurance companies do not pursue anyone. The survivors of the collateral damage do not sue. The destruction is real in the moment and absent from the record immediately afterward. And this is not unique to the chicken fights. It is how the show handles nearly everything. It is, perhaps, the defining structural feature of its reality. Section 7. Meg Griffin and the question that deserved more than it got. The treatment of Meg Griffin across Family Guy's long run is one of the most documented aspects of the show's history, and the documentation is necessary because the accumulation of what she endured across roughly 10 seasons requires cataloging to be fully comprehended. But within all that documentation, there is a specific question that tends to get overlooked because the focus is usually on the treatment itself rather than its causes. Within the fiction, within the world where the Griffins are real people whose behavior has causes and consequences, why does this happen? And why does it happen to Meg specifically, rather than to any other member of the family? The show has offered answers in fragments. The most extended in-universe explanation comes from the season 10 episode Seahorse Seashell Party. Meg, trapped in the house during a hurricane with her family, has a confrontation. She stands up. She tells Peter in specific terms what kind of father he has been. She tells Lois, with similar specificity, what kind of mother. She articulates what it has been like to absorb the family's dysfunction as the person at the bottom of its hierarchy. The speeches are well written, they are accurate. The things she describes are things that have actually happened, not exaggerations created for the argument. The family listens, and without Meg in the role of the person everybody can take things out on, the dynamic collapses. The frustrations that used to flow toward her start flowing everywhere else, toward each other, toward the walls, without direction. The family cannot function without a target, and the episode makes this visible in a way that the show had been obscuring for years by treating Meg's abuse as humor, rather than as a structural element of the household's psychology. The episode ends with Meg taking it all back. She accepts that this is her role. She goes to Brian and describes herself as the lightning rod of the family, the person who draws the charge so that everyone else can stay safe. Whether this is insight or resignation or some painful combination of both is left to the viewer. The show clearly intends it as insight. Many viewers experienced it as something darker. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister adds the layer that gives the family's treatment of Meg the most coherent in-universe explanation. Karen Griffin, Peter's sister, appears in the show for the first time in this episode. She is immediately established as a bully, physically large, emotionally dominant, the kind of person who establishes her power through the humiliation of whoever is nearest. And we learn that she bullied Peter throughout his childhood. That Peter was, in the household he grew up in, exactly what Meg is in his household. The person at the bottom, the one who absorbed whatever everyone else needed to discharge. The cycle is named. Peter treats Meg the way Karen treated him, not because he consciously decided to replicate the pattern, but because the pattern is the only template he has for how a more powerful person relates to a less powerful one in a family. Context. He knows in the oldest part of himself what it feels like to be Meg, and rather than that knowledge creating empathy, it has produced repetition. Because repetition is what happens to patterns that are never examined. Meg, having learned about Karen and about Peter's childhood, forgives her father in that episode with a generosity that is genuinely moving. It is one of the more emotionally honest moments in the show's later run, a daughter extending to her father a grace he has not earned, but that she offers anyway, because she understands something about the mechanism that has been running. Peter acknowledges, in that moment, that he has been terrible to her. The next episode, they are back to where they started. This is the thing the show does consistently with Meg, and it is the thing that makes her mystery so specifically melancholy. The show knows how to write her with depth. It proves this every few seasons, in an episode that gives her a genuine interior life and a moment of dignity and sometimes even agency. And then the reset comes. The insight evaporates. The pattern reasserts itself. And the question of who Meg might have been, if the show had decided to develop rather than diminish her, remains one of the most haunting what-ifs in the history of animated television. There is also the real-world explanation that Seth MacFarlane provided in interviews, which the show eventually acknowledged through various means. His writing staff was largely male, and nobody in the room had the specific experience of being a teenage girl navigating the particular pressures of that existence. The lack of understanding produced a default. She became the character that absorbed what couldn't otherwise be processed. When women joined the writing staff in more significant numbers, beginning around season 14 or 15, Meg's treatment visibly improved. Her episodes became more substantive. Her character was given competence, resilience, and moments of genuine triumph that the earlier seasons had systematically denied her. By season 22, the extreme abuse had largely stopped. Meg had storylines where she was smart, capable, and interesting in her own right. She pushed back against bullies instead of simply absorbing them. She showed qualities that suggested, if you squinted, the character who might have existed all along if different choices had been made. But the 10 seasons between the beginning and the improvement happened. They are in the record. And the question that the in-universe story keeps posing, why this person, why this family, what does it mean for a household to require a sacrifice? And to have made that sacrifice a person is one that the show addressed in fragments, but never fully assembled into an answer. The treatment of Meg also created a specific dynamic in the show's relationship with its audience that is worth examining. Meg's abuse became, for a period, a kind of shared cultural shorthand, a reference point that people who watched Family Guy used to signal their familiarity with the show. "Shut up, Meg," or versions of it, became something people quoted not just in the context of discussing the show, but as a way of dismissing someone in conversation. The fictional cruelty became a template for real-world dismissal. This bleed from fiction to social behavior is one of the more uncomfortable aspects of the Meg storyline's legacy. When Mila Kunis, the actress who provides Meg's voice, spoke about having the dismissive catchphrase directed at her in real life by strangers who found it amusing to say that phrase to the woman who gave the character her voice, that moment of discomfort reveals the mechanism clearly. The joke had detached from its context. It was no longer just a Family Guy reference. It had become a culturally available tool for dismissal, one that many people deployed without thinking much about what they were actually doing. There's a question embedded in this that the show has never addressed and probably couldn't address within its format. What is the effect of depicting a specific category of person as inherently deserving of ridicule? Not just in terms of Meg specifically, but in terms of what the show was normalizing about how to treat people who occupy certain social positions, the unpopular, the uncool, the person who fails to command respect from the people around them. The show presented Meg's treatment as comedy, which implicitly suggested that the treatment was a legitimate response to the kind of person she was. And the audience, watching that for 10 seasons, absorbed that implicit suggestion along with the jokes. The later improvement in how Meg was written doesn't erase this. What the show did during its worst Meg period cannot be retroactively undone by later seasons where she was handled better. The record exists, and the question of what that record means, what it says about the show's values during that period, and what it says about the audiences that found it funny is a question that remains genuinely open and genuinely worth thinking about. Section 8. Lois Griffin's Hidden Past and the Person She Chose to Stop Being. Lois Patrice Griffin, née Pewterschmidt, is the load-bearing wall of her household. She is the person who makes things function. Her patience, her organizational competence, her capacity for managing chaos without being consumed by it, her ability to love Peter genuinely, despite everything that loving Peter requires, all of these are presented as so natural and so constant that they seem like the default conditions of her existence. Like she simply grew up and became this, settled into competence and steadiness the way a person settles into a comfortable chair. Except she didn't. The Lois of Spooner Street is not who Lois Pewterschmidt started as. The person she is now is the result of choices made over many years, and the evidence of who she was before those choices is scattered throughout the show in ways that accumulate into a portrait of considerable complexity. The most publicly discussed revelation about Lois's past arrived in the Season 9 episode, And I'm Joyce Kinney. In that episode, Lois befriends a local news anchor, a woman named Joyce Kinney, and in the course of their developing friendship, Lois reveals a secret she has kept since her college years in the early 1980s. She appeared in a pornographic film. The film is called Quest for Fur. She tells Joyce this in confidence. Joyce tells everyone in the city the next morning on the local news broadcast because Joyce has been carrying a grudge against Lois for decades, stemming from an incident of public humiliation at a school party that Lois inflicted on her when they were young. The pornographic film is played for comedy, as almost everything in Family Guy is played for comedy. But the fact of its existence says something. A woman who makes an adult film in her early 20s, prior to settling into suburban respectability in her 30s, is a woman who inhabited her life very differently at those 2 points. The college-age Lois who made that choice was not the Lois of Spooner Street. She was someone with different concerns, different habits, a different relationship to conventional respectability. The shift between then and now is not explained. It is simply evident in the gap between who she was and who she became. The romantic history adds more texture. Lois has confessed, across various episodes, to having dated several musicians in the period before she met Peter. She slept with Gene Simmons. She had a period, during her college years, that she confirmed in the episode Partial Terms of Endearment, when she was involved with women. She had an affair with former President Bill Clinton during a Season 5 episode, something that Peter eventually learns about and ultimately forgives, in a moment that is partly funny and partly a genuine insight into the adaptability of long marriages. And she has a brother who is a serial killer. This is the most dramatically striking element of Lois's family background, and it is handled by the show in the most understated way possible. Her brother Patrick was institutionalized for targeting overweight men. He briefly gets out during the episode he appears in. The episode uses him to generate danger for Peter, who is an overweight man. The episode resolves, Patrick goes back, and the show moves on. The fact that Lois Griffin's brother is a serial killer sits in the record of the show as a piece of information that the writers deposited there and then largely forgot. What the accumulation of this information suggests is a family of origin, the Pewterschmidts, that was profoundly unhealthy beneath its wealthy exterior. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, is one of the more consistently drawn characters in the show's supporting cast. An old-money patriarch who treats everyone as beneath him and views relationships primarily in terms of leverage and obligation. He has, over the show's run, done numerous things that are genuinely cruel in the casual, entitled way of a man who has never been meaningfully held accountable for anything. Barbara, Lois's mother, exists primarily as a background figure present at family events, decorative, not substantially characterized. From that family, 2 children emerged. One of them is a serial killer. One of them became Lois Griffin, who by every visible measure is the most functional person in any room she occupies. The distance between those 2 outcomes from the same household is enormous, and the show never explains how Lois arrived at the person she is across that distance, what decisions she made along the way, what she left behind, what she chose to become, and what she chose to stop being. Whether the stability she maintains in her current life is as natural as it looks or whether it is its own kind of performance, sustained with effort that the show never fully acknowledges, because acknowledging it would change the function she serves in the story. She also has a long-lost brother named Carl, who appears in one episode and is revealed to be a serial killer targeting overweight men, which, combined with Patrick, gives Lois a remarkable family legacy of sibling violence that the show has never gathered into a coherent picture of the Pewterschmidt family's specific dysfunction. The mystery of Lois isn't really about the pornographic film or the celebrity affairs or her siblings' violence. The mystery is how she managed the journey from that family to this one. What the Pewterschmidt household produced in her that she has spent her adult life working against, and whether the person she is now on Spooner Street is continuous with the person she was before, or whether she is, in some sense, a second person living in the first person's adult body, carrying the past without being defined by it. Lois's relationship with Peter is itself one of the show's deepest mysteries, because the show has spent 25 years building a case that their marriage should not work and simultaneously presenting it as something that endures. Lois is, by any objective measure, substantially more capable than Peter in almost every domain that affects the family's daily life. She manages the household, manages the finances to whatever degree they are managed, manages the children, and manages Peter himself to a degree that would make most people reconsider the relationship. She is patient in ways that require real effort. She is loving in ways that require real forgiveness. And she stays. Not just out of inertia and not just because the show needs her to stay. She stays in ways that the show has occasionally allowed to feel genuinely chosen episodes where she has had the opportunity to leave and declined, moments where she has articulated why she loves Peter in terms that make the love feel real rather than comedic. The specific combination of qualities she sees in him, some genuine affection for her, some irreducible sweetness underneath the stupidity, some loyalty that persists through everything, is never fully explained, but it is depicted often enough that the marriage feels like a real thing rather than simply a plot necessity. The mystery of Lois's choice to stay, and to keep choosing to stay, is one that the show gestures at more than it explains. What she gets from the marriage, what it gives her that she couldn't find elsewhere, is suggested in scenes where Peter shows up for her in the specific way that only he seems capable of showing up, some instinctive loyalty that overrides the intellectual mess. But the full accounting of the transaction has never been laid out. We see the costs clearly. The benefits are mostly implied. Her choice to have built this life, to have left the Pewterschmidt world and its money and its status and its complicated dysfunction, to have chosen a man who is in almost every measurable way. Her opposite is a choice the show respects without fully explaining. And perhaps that is the correct approach. Some choices are most honest when they remain somewhat mysterious, even to the person who made them. Section 9. Glenn Quagmire. The history underneath the catchphrase. Glenn Quagmire is, in his most visible manifestation, a joke. He is the hypersexual neighbor. The pilot with the implausible love life. The man whose catchphrase has outlived the context in which it was created and become something that exists independently in the culture. He is in the comedy ecosystem of Family Guy, a reliable generator of a specific category of humor, and that humor tends to operate at the surface level of his character because the surface level is where the joke lives. But Quagmire has accumulated, over the show's long run, a backstory that complicates the surface version of him substantially. The darkness that lives underneath the catchphrase is a different kind of darkness, the kind that comes from a life that has included things most people don't carry, handled in ways that were never expected of the character the show initially presented. Start with the question of his age, which is one of the more openly acknowledged impossibilities in the show's canon. Quagmire's stated age has never been fixed. In some episodes, he appears to be roughly the same age as Peter, putting him in his mid-40s. In other episodes, the details of his backstory put him somewhere significantly older. Calculations based on military service references, specific dates mentioned in dialogue, and the age he would have to be for certain historical events he has described to have occurred when he claims they did, suggest that Quagmire should be somewhere north of 60, possibly considerably older. The show is aware of this inconsistency. It has made jokes about it, specifically through Quagmire's apparent agelessness, which the other characters occasionally notice and comment on. Quagmire himself deflects or complicates the subject when it comes up, with a practiced evasiveness that suggests someone who has reasons for keeping the details unclear. The military history is more grounded. Quagmire served in the Vietnam War. This was established most clearly in the season 16 episode Family Guy Through the Years, which presented the show as a television program that had been running since the 1950s. In the 1970s segment, Quagmire returns from Vietnam, and the description of his experience carries the texture of something genuine, not just a reference inserted for comic value, but something drawn with actual awareness of what that war was and what it did to the people who served in it. His father Dan's story is the most dramatically serious thing ever attached to the Quagmire family. Dan Quagmire, a naval veteran of the Vietnam War, is introduced in the episode Quagmire's Dad, and the storyline centers on Dan announcing that he intends to undergo gender reassignment surgery. He becomes Ida. Quagmire's struggle to understand and accept this is treated with a nuance and emotional care that the show rarely sustains for any storyline. The episode forces Quagmire to confront a version of his parent he was not prepared for and to work through what that confrontation means for how he understands his family and himself. The resolution is imperfect, as most honest depictions of this kind of acceptance process tend to be, but it's real. It asks something of the character that the catchphrase version of Quagmire would never have been asked. His sister Brenda's story adds another dimension of genuine darkness. Brenda is in an abusive relationship, and her storyline involves the Griffin Circle trying to intervene. The episode ends with Quagmire killing Brenda's abuser Jeff to protect her. This is presented as justified, as an act of love rather than violence, as the action of a man who chose to protect his family by any means available. It is the most serious use of violence as a story element that the show has ever produced, and it is centered on a character who is otherwise primarily a vehicle for sexual comedy. Seth MacFarlane has described Quagmire's character as rooted in a 1950s sensibility, a man whose social programming was established in an earlier cultural moment that he never fully updated. The voice MacFarlane does for him is based on fast-talking radio disc jockeys of the post-war era. The idea is that Quagmire is, in some temporal sense, a person who belongs to a different decade and is navigating the present with maps drawn from the past. The mystery of Quagmire is the mystery of what would happen if the show ever fully committed to the person underneath the joke. The Vietnam veteran, the son of a parent whose transition required him to update everything he thought he understood about where he came from. The man who killed someone to protect his sister. That person, developed consistently and with care, would be one of the most interesting characters in the show's history. The show has touched him from time to time. It has never stayed. The age question remains the floating symbol of all of this. A character whose years don't add up is a character whose history hasn't cohered. The math of Quagmire's timeline refuses to resolve because the character himself refuses to resolve, held in productive tension between the joke and the person, the surface and the depth, the catchphrase and the story behind it that is still, after 25 years, waiting to be told in full. Quagmire's age mystery also has a specific episode that makes it most vivid, and it's worth sitting with. In the episode where his actual age is most directly addressed, the number that comes up is something implausibly high, high enough that the other characters are visibly stunned, And the joke is that Quagmire has been alive for far longer than his appearance or his behavior suggests. He appears youthful. He acts in ways associated with a particular kind of youth, or at least with a refusal to age emotionally. But the number on the page tells a different story. The implication never stated directly is that Quagmire ages differently, or that he has chosen, in some deep and private way, not to age in the relevant senses. Not physically, and not in terms of updating the internal programs he runs on. The man who was trained in the 1950s, who served in a war in the 1970s, who has been conducting the same romantic life since approximately the Eisenhower administration, is a man who has resisted the kind of interior renovation that most people undergo, willingly or unwillingly, as the decades accumulate. He has stayed who he was. The aging is numerical but not experiential. This connects him, oddly, to the broader condition of all the characters in this show, the floating present, the refusal to age. Quagmire is simply more honest about it. His impossible age is the thing the show has always been doing with every character, just named and numbered for comedy in his case, rather than left implicit in the others. He is the floating present made visible, the embodiment of the show's refusal to let its characters develop across time. His relationship with Brian over the years, the specific animosity, the famous speech in which Quagmire tells Brian exactly what he finds insufferable about him, the ongoing feud that becomes one of the show's recurring dynamics is interesting, partly because it represents Quagmire being honest in a way that the show rarely allows characters to be honest with each other. When Quagmire delivers his assessment of Brian, every point he makes is accurate. Brian is pretentious. Brian has treated Peter's family poorly. Brian has abandoned responsibilities. Brian's self-image does not match his behavior. Quagmire sees this and says so, directly, which makes him the most honest voice in a cast full of people who generally avoid uncomfortable truths. This capacity for directness is underused. The show gives Quagmire moments of genuine moral clarity, the Brian speech, the protection of his sister, the navigation of his father's transition, and then returns him to the catchphrase. The moral clarity is more interesting than the catchphrase. The show knows this. It visits it periodically and then walks away. Section 10. The world itself. What kind of reality is this, and who made its rules? All the mysteries we've explored so far have been about characters. About specific people and specific questions: who they are, where they came from, what they want, what they feel. But there is a larger mystery underneath all of them, one that contains them the way a body of water contains whatever lives inside it. The world of Family Guy does not operate according to consistent rules, and the inconsistency is not accidental, it is structural. It is embedded in the show's DNA in ways that have been present since the very first episode and have never been resolved. Consider the question of time. The characters of Family Guy have been the same ages for over 25 years. Stewie has been 1 year old since 1999. He has been 1 year old through multiple administrations, through technological revolutions, through cultural shifts that have remade the world around him while he has remained exactly where he started. In a high chair in Rhode Island, 1 year old, unchanged. Chris and Meg have been in high school since the show began. They have not graduated, not grown up, not aged out of the storylines their ages create. Peter has been in his mid-40s since the beginning. The entire family exists in what fans have come to call the floating present, a permanent now that keeps renewing itself, without the characters growing old or the world actually changing in permanent ways. This would be unremarkable if the show existed as pure episodic comedy, with no investment in continuity. But Family Guy repeatedly and emphatically anchors its characters to specific historical events. Quagmire served in Vietnam. Peter's biological father is an Irishman he met for the first time at age 43. Events happen to the characters at specific points in their lives, which implies a timeline, which implies the passage of time. The show keeps gesturing toward a continuous history while also keeping everyone permanently in the same moment. The contradiction creates a world where, if you try to map it, everything becomes unstable. The ages don't match the biographies. The things that should have changed the characters permanently are followed in the next episode by the characters being exactly as they were before. The rules of what persists, what deaths are real, what revelations stick, what transformations hold shift from episode to episode based entirely on what the current story requires. Brian's death in Season 12 was the most dramatic demonstration of this. The show killed Brian Griffin. Not as a fake-out, not as a dream sequence, as an actual narrative event. Brian was hit by a car and died. The Griffin family mourned him. Stewie was devastated in ways that were specific and raw. A new dog, Vinny, was brought in. The death was treated as real. It trended nationally on social media. The internet had feelings about it that were, by any measure, out of proportion to the death of a fictional dog on a cartoon about a dysfunctional family, which tells you something about how genuinely people had attached to him. 2 episodes later, Brian came back. Stewie retrieved a time travel device and went back and saved Brian before the car hit him. Brian returned to the household. Vinny was retroactively unintroduced. Everything reset. The death had never been intended to stick. It was a device, a way to generate attention and emotion and conversation, deployed with the full knowledge that it would be reversed. The show demonstrated, in the most compressed possible form, its fundamental relationship with consequence. Consequences happen in this world, and then they unhappen, and the world returns to whatever condition the show has decided is its default. This is not a failure of craft. It is a choice. The show is structured to have it both ways, to generate real emotional stakes and then retract them, to change things and then change them back, to make the audience feel something and then make the something go away. The result is a world where nothing can ultimately be trusted to mean what it appears to mean, because the show's history has demonstrated that any development can be undone if the writers decide that the undoing serves the story better than the development did. The question this creates, the mystery that underlies all the other mysteries, is what kind of world produces these specific conditions? There are fan theories, of course. The most elegant one is the idea that the world of Family Guy exists inside Stewie's time machine, which he has been running as a simulation for reasons that are never specified. Under this reading, the inconsistencies of the timeline are the inconsistencies of a controlled experiment. The fact that characters don't age is because their ages have been fixed as parameters. The fact that deaths can be undone is because the simulation can be reset. The fact that the rules change from episode to episode is because someone keeps adjusting the variables. This theory has the enormous advantage of being able to account for everything. It makes the show's incoherence legible as intentional. It gives the floating present a mechanism. It explains Brian's death and return within a framework that doesn't require the audience to simply suspend disbelief about consequence. And it gives Stewie a role in the show's reality that matches the suggestion, in so many episodes, that he understands something about the nature of this world that the other characters do not. But the theory has no canonical support. It is an interpretive overlay, a frame the audience places on the show rather than one the show provides. And Family Guy has never shown interest in providing that frame, because the ambiguity is more useful to it than any explanation would be. What the show is, at its deepest structural level, is 2 things in tension. It is a serialized story with ongoing characters whose relationships develop over time and whose histories inform who they are. And it is an anthology of loosely connected comedy sketches, in which each episode is essentially self-contained and the characters reset between them. These 2 modes are fundamentally incompatible, and the show has never chosen between them. It has simply continued being both, letting the tension produce the specific flavor of incoherence that is, by now, entirely recognizable as Family Guy. The great unanswered question is what this world actually is. Not just what its rules are, but what its nature is. What kind of place maintains the same family in the same house for over 25 years without aging them? What kind of place has a baby who might be an evil genius, or might be something else entirely? A dog who might be a CIA experiment, or might be the story's author? A giant chicken who started a feud over a coupon and keeps coming back from what should be death? A teenage girl who absorbs the household's dysfunction without the rest of the family ever properly accounting for what they've asked of her? All of the mysteries we've walked through tonight, Stewie's voice, Stewie's accent, Stewie's sexuality, Peter's real father, Brian's true origin, Ernie's inexhaustible grievance, Meg's role in the family, Lois's hidden past, Quagmire's unclosable backstory, and the nature of the world that contains them all, none of them will be answered completely. The show has made its peace with incompleteness. It has chosen ambiguity as a permanent condition rather than a temporary state. And there is something right about that. There is something that fits. The families we actually come from are full of questions that don't resolve. The people we love carry histories we never fully access. The rules of the world we live in are inconsistent in ways that become visible only when we're forced to look directly at them. The Griffin family, In all their dysfunction and warmth and cruelty and occasional grace, is a cartoon of the thing all families are. A collection of people who do not fully understand each other, held together by something that defies complete explanation, occupying a world whose rules they didn't choose and can't change, and mostly don't think about directly. Somewhere in Quahog, Rhode Island, it is evening. Stewie is in his crib, speaking in a voice that nobody in his household knows is not his own. Brian is reading, or trying to write, or simply sitting with his thoughts in the way the early version of him always seemed to be doing. Peter is watching television and not thinking about the Irishman whose blood he carries. Lois is holding it all together through some combination of love and habit and the particular stubbornness of someone who decided, a long time ago, to be this person and has not yet found a reason to stop. Meg is in her room, Quagmire is at the bar. The chicken is out there somewhere. The questions remain open. They will probably remain open for as long as the show runs, which, based on the renewal deal currently in place, is at least through 2029, perhaps beyond. The machine keeps running, the mysteries keep accumulating, and in the quiet hours, when the credits roll and the room goes still, there is something almost comfortable about not having the answers, about sitting with the questions in the dark and letting them keep you company for a little while longer. The question of what this world is also raises a quieter question about what the show's continued existence means. Family Guy, as of its most recent renewal announcement in April 2025, has been guaranteed life through at least its 30th anniversary through season 27, which would take it to the 2028 to 2029 television season. Each season under the new deal consists of 15 episodes. The show will continue producing new material, new mysteries, new unanswered questions. Seth MacFarlane, in a 2024 interview, described the show's continuation in terms that were honest but not exactly passionate. He said he didn't see a good reason to stop making it because people still watched it and enjoyed it, and the revenue it generated supported charitable causes he cared about. He described the show as having achieved what he called escape velocity. It had been going so long that there was no logical reason to end it unless the audience stopped caring. He said there had been a time when he thought it was time to wrap things up, but he had moved past that. The framing is interesting because it describes a show that continues not out of creative urgency, but out of momentum and commercial logic. The show keeps running because it can run, and because it is profitable enough to justify running, and because the infrastructure that produces it is still functioning. This is a different kind of reason for making a television show than the reasons that produced seasons 1 through 3. Those seasons were made by a person who had a specific vision of what this world should be and specific things he wanted to say through it. The current seasons are made because the machine is still capable of making them. And yet the mysteries persist. Stewie is still 1 year old. Brian still cannot explain why he exists. The chicken is still out there, somewhere, carrying his grievance. Meg has gotten better, but the decade of her worst treatment is still in the record. Lois's past is still partially obscured. Quagmire is still ageless and somewhat unexplained. Peter is still technically a McFinnigan. The questions that the early seasons built into the show's foundations haven't been resolved or removed. They just accumulate, season after season, becoming more layered and more complex as the show adds to them without subtracting anything. In a strange way, the unresolvability of these mysteries is the most honest thing about the show. It is a show about a family, and families don't resolve their mysteries. They live with them. They carry questions about each other that never get answered. Histories that are only partially known. Relationships whose true nature is never fully articulated. The Griffins, in their permanent present, in their floating now, in their world that resets and continues and refuses to be coherent, are enacting something that most families will recognize from the inside. The show's greatest mystery might be itself. How did this particular combination of characters and questions and jokes and warmth and cruelty and reset buttons become something that people have been watching, thinking about, arguing about, and returning to for over a quarter century? What is the thing in Family Guy that holds people, not just the casual viewer who puts it on in the background, but the person who is listening to this right now, in the dark, letting the questions wash over them because something in the questions feels worth sitting with? That question has no answer that would survive being stated out loud. It is the mystery that contains all the others. It is the thing you feel when you are in the right kind of quiet, and the familiar music plays, and the familiar family appears on the screen in their familiar house, and you settle into the experience of something that is For all its absurdity and all its failures and all its unanswered questions, genuinely and stubbornly yours. Good night. Good night wherever you are. The mysteries will be here when you wake up. If you made it all the way through this one, that means something. These videos are long by design, built for the late hours when the world gets quiet and the mind wants something to settle into without requiring too much from it. If this gave you that tonight, the best thing you can do is subscribe. It keeps this channel alive and makes more nights like this one possible. And drop where you're watching from in the comments, the time, the place, the corner of the world you're in right now. Every location someone leaves is a reminder of how far these quiet conversations travel. Sleep well. There is another dimension to the Stewie hearing question that becomes visible when you consider the show's history of fourth wall breaks. In later seasons especially, Family Guy developed a habit of having its characters acknowledge, directly or obliquely, that they are in a television show. Peter would speak to the camera, characters would reference the writers, the network, the format. These moments of meta-awareness are presented as comedy, but they also have an effect on the show's internal logic. If the characters can acknowledge the show's artificial nature when it serves a joke, then the question of whether Stewie can be heard within the fiction is complicated further by the fact that the fiction itself is sometimes suspended. When the show breaks the fourth wall and Stewie participates in those moments, which he does, particularly in later seasons, it becomes harder to locate him within a consistent reality. He is sometimes in the world of the show, operating as a character with limited access to the truth of his situation. He is sometimes speaking as a participant in the broader fiction, aware of the cameras, addressing the audience directly. These two modes don't coexist easily, and the question of who hears Stewie in each mode is different. In the first mode, the hearing question is genuinely mysterious. In the second mode, it becomes irrelevant, because Stewie is no longer inside the story, he is outside it, commenting on it. The show has never cleanly separated these modes, which means that the Stewie, who sometimes can and sometimes cannot be heard, is also sometimes in the story and sometimes observing the story from outside it. The hearing question is ultimately insoluble, not just because the show chose ambiguity, but because the show's relationship with its own reality is too complicated to allow a clean answer to any question about what happens inside it. The question of Meg's father in the earliest seasons, before the Meg abuse storyline took over, is worth revisiting because those early episodes contain a version of Peter and Meg's relationship that the show largely abandoned. In Season 1, Peter was not a good father to Meg in the specific sense that he was inattentive and self-absorbed, but there were moments, episodes where he demonstrated that he cared about her in ways that felt genuine. An episode called A Picture's Worth $1,000 involved Peter finding what he believed to be evidence of Chris's artistic talent and investing enormous energy in pursuing it. But the episode also contained quieter moments of Peter trying to understand his kids in ways that the later seasons lost. The father of Season 1 was not the abuser of Season 8. He was something more complicated and more human, a man who genuinely loved his children but had no clear idea how to show it. The decay of that version of Peter into something crueler is one of the show's most poorly managed transitions. It happened gradually enough that each individual step seemed defensible in isolation. A little meaner here, a little more extreme there. And then at some point in the middle seasons, the accumulation crossed a threshold, and the Peter who emerged on the other side of that threshold bore only superficial resemblance to the Peter who started the show. Meg was the primary casualty of this transition. She was the character whose treatment most visibly tracked Peter's deterioration, because she was the character most vulnerable to it. As Peter became less capable of genuine care, Meg was the person who paid the highest price, because she was the one who needed care most and could least easily find it elsewhere. The mystery of Meg and the mystery of Peter are, ultimately, the same mystery. What happened to the warmth that existed in this show's early seasons? And is there any path back to it? One of the questions the show circles around without ever answering is the question of the Griffin house itself. The house at 31 Spooner Street has been the center of this universe since the very first episode, and it is, like so many things in Family Guy, impossible if you try to map it consistently. The number of rooms it contains, the layout of its floors, the configuration of its kitchen and living room and bedrooms, these things change from episode to episode with a casualness that suggests the show has never considered them fixed. The house is bigger when the story requires it to be bigger. It is smaller when a joke needs compression. The backyard expands and contracts. The attic, which Stewie uses as a weapon storage facility in various episodes, seems to have dimensions that don't correspond to the exterior dimensions of the house. This is standard animation practice. Cartoon homes frequently violate the spatial logic of real architecture because spatial logic is beside the point. But in a show that also wants to be about a real family in a real place, the elasticity of the physical environment contributes to the dreamlike quality that the whole show has when you step back and look at it. Nothing stays fixed. Nothing maintains its size or shape or configuration across time. The house, like the family, like the timeline, is whatever it needs to be. There is a theory among certain fans that the Griffin house is, in some sense, alive not in the supernatural sense, but in the sense that the show treats it as a character rather than a setting. Things happen in that house that would not happen in a real building. Its dimensions accommodate whatever the plot requires. Its history contains whatever the writers decide it contains. The house is not a location. It is a container for whatever family life is being depicted in this particular episode, and its physical properties change to match that life rather than constraining it. This is another expression of the show's fundamental relationship with reality. The external world shapes itself to accommodate the story, rather than the story being shaped by the constraints of the external world. Everything is flexible. Everything bends to narrative purpose. And the house, as the show's most constant physical presence, embodies this flexibility more completely than anything else in the frame. The mystery of the Griffin house is the mystery of Family Guy's world compressed into 31 Spooner Street, a place that is always familiar and never quite consistent, that feels like home without obeying the rules that homes obey, that contains more than it should and adjusts itself without acknowledgement to contain whatever is needed. It is the perfect setting for a show that has always been more interested in the feeling of a thing than in its structural coherence. The house feels like a home. That is enough. That is, perhaps, the truest thing the show has ever built. The questions about it: how many bedrooms does it actually have? Where does Stewie store everything? How does the layout accommodate the episodes it accommodates? Are questions the show will never answer, because answering them would require the house to become a real place. And a real place would have rules that the story couldn't break when it needed to. Better to leave the house as it is, familiar, warm, slightly impossible, and full of people who are doing their best with the lives they've been given. Which is, when you think about it, the truest description of this entire show. Good night, sleep well, the house is quiet, the questions are still there, gentle as ever, waiting for whenever you're ready to return to them.